I was standing just a few steps from the execution yard when I heard the bell tower begin to wind up. I could feel it before I heard it, that low mechanical groan of gears turning, preparing to ring the hour. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the sealed envelope I was carrying. Inside that envelope was one piece of evidence, one document that could stop everything. But the iron gates ahead of me were already shut. The guards were already in position, and every person in that courtyard had already made peace with what was about to happen. Every person except me. I had maybe 30 seconds to make a decision that would either save an innocent man's life or haunt me for the rest of mine. And here is what I need you to understand before I go any further. By the time this story is over, you will know that the hardest part of what I did was never finding the truth. The hardest part was convincing people to believe it before time completely ran out. To understand why I found myself running toward that prison on the most important morning of my life, I need to take you back to the beginning. Back to the woman I was before any of this happened. My name is Sister Marguerite. I had lived inside the walls of the convent of St. Etta for nearly 18 years by the time this story begins. My life was simple, and I loved it for exactly that reason. I woke before dawn. I prayed. I helped the infirmary sisters tend to the sick. And 3 times each week, I was permitted to leave the convent grounds and walk the 2 miles into the town of Valancourt to visit the prisoners held inside Castellan prison. That was my ministry. Not preaching, not judging, just listening. I believed then, as I believe now, that the most forgotten people in any society are the ones locked behind iron doors, and I made it my quiet purpose to make sure they knew that at least one person in the world still saw them as human beings. Valancourt was an old town in an old fictional country with old laws. Public executions were still legally sanctioned under the Territorial Justice Code that governed the Valancourt district, a code that dated back nearly 2 centuries and had never been fully reformed. I had protested those laws through proper channels many times. I had written letters. I had signed petitions. I had sat in hearing rooms where men in powdered wigs looked right through me. But the law remained, and so did the executions, and all I could do was make sure the condemned men did not walk their final road alone. I first heard the name Elias Croft in the autumn of the year the great drought came to Valancourt. He had been convicted of murdering a wealthy merchant named Aldrich Vane, a man whose death had sent the entire town into an uproar. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Multiple witnesses placed Elias at the scene. His coat was found near the body. A shop ledger showed he owed Aldrich a significant debt. The trial lasted only 4 days. The jury took less than 1 hour to convict. Even the newspapers said the verdict was obvious. When I first walked into Elias's cell, I expected to find what I usually found: a broken man, frightened, perhaps desperate for absolution. Instead, I found someone who barely looked up from the floor. He did not beg. He did not cry. He simply said quietly that there was no point in talking because no one would believe him anyway. That single sentence stayed with me like a splinter I could not remove. I went back the following week, and the week after that. Slowly, Elias began to talk. Not in the way a guilty man tries to convince someone of his innocence. He talked the way a person talks when they have simply given up on being heard. He described where he actually was the night Aldrich Vane was killed. He said he had been delivering grain sacks to a warehouse on the eastern side of the river alone, because the usual helper had fallen ill. No alibi, no witness, just his word against everything else. I told myself not to get attached. I told myself I had heard plenty of men in those cells insist they were innocent. But something kept pulling at me. It started with one small detail he mentioned almost in passing about the coat. He said the coat they found near the body wasn't his coat. It was similar, he said, but the buttons were wrong. His coat had bone buttons. The coat in evidence had brass buttons. I thought about that for days. Finally, I went to look at the evidence log stored in the prison clerk's archive, and the log said bone buttons. But the coat on display in the evidence room had brass buttons. That single inconsistency cracked the entire case open for me. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my small cell inside the convent and I went over every detail Elias had told me, and I wrote everything down by candlelight. The next morning, I went to the town records office and asked to review the original witness depositions from the trial. The clerk looked at me like I had asked to read the king's private correspondence, but I stood there quietly and patiently until he relented. What I found in those depositions made my blood run cold. The primary witness, a man named Gustave Marin, had described seeing Elias leave the scene carrying a dark bundle. But in his original deposition, filed 4 days before the trial, Gustave said the figure he saw was shorter and walked with a slight limp. Elias Croft was 6 feet tall and walked without any limp. Someone had amended that deposition between the original filing and the trial copy. The handwriting in the correction was slightly different, just slightly, enough to notice if you were looking. And I was looking. I brought this to the head prison magistrate, a man named Warden Aldous. He dismissed me within 4 minutes. He told me that the case was closed, that the execution was scheduled, and that a nun with a notebook was not going to reopen a legally settled conviction. I walked out of that office shaking, not from fear, from fury. That night, someone slipped a folded note under the convent gate. It said 3 words. Search the mill. I showed it to no one. The following morning, before the sun had fully risen, I walked to the old grain mill on the edge of town that had belonged to Aldrich Vane before his death. I don't know what I expected to find. What I found was a rusted tin box behind a collapsed interior wall, filled with correspondence. Letters between Aldrich Vane and a business partner named Roland Fetch, letters that revealed a massive financial fraud that Aldrich had been threatening to expose. Letters that showed Roland Fetch stood to lose everything if Aldrich lived, and tucked at the very bottom of that box a journal entry in Aldrich's own hand, dated just 2 days before his murder, describing how he feared Roland Fetch was planning to silence him permanently. I had been sitting on that floor for nearly 2 hours before I realized I was crying. Roland Fetch, I later discovered through the town property registrar, had also employed a man who walked with a limp and was of shorter build, a courier whose name appeared on no witness list, and whose connection to the case had never been explored because the investigators had stopped looking the moment they found Elias's coat, except that coat had been planted, and I could prove it, the limp, the height, the altered deposition, the forged evidence log, the journal, the letters, every piece fit together so completely that I could hardly breathe from the weight of it. I went straight to the Regional Justice Council offices with everything I had. I was turned away at the door. I returned an hour later with the town archivist, an elderly woman named Hesta, who had worked with those records for 40 years and immediately confirmed that the deposition had been altered and that the alteration post-dated the original filing. Still, the duty official told me that no stay of execution could be granted without authorization from the High Warden himself, who was in session until the following morning. The execution was scheduled for 8 o'clock the next morning. I spent that entire night writing. I organized every document, every letter, every journal page, every inconsistency into a sealed evidentiary report, and just before dawn, I walked to the private residence of an elderly retired judge named Harlan Morse, who had written publicly in the past about the broken state of the Valancourt justice system. I knocked on his door at 5:30 in the morning. He opened it in his dressing robe, squinting at me in the gray light. I handed him the sealed report, and I told him I needed 15 minutes of his time, or an innocent man was going to die in 3 hours. He gave me 2 hours. Judge Morse read every page. He asked precise questions. He called for a courier to bring the town archivist to his home. Hesta arrived within 20 minutes and confirmed every document I had presented. At 7:45 in the morning, Judge Morse signed an emergency instrument under a rarely invoked provision of the Territorial Code that allowed a senior justice official to issue a temporary halt to any execution pending immediate evidentiary review. He handed me the sealed instrument, looked me directly in the eyes, and said, "Run!" And I ran. I ran 2 miles through Valancourt in my habit and my worn leather shoes, holding that envelope against my chest like it was the only solid thing left in the world. I arrived at the Castellan prison gates at 1 minute past 8. I could hear the gears of the bell tower beginning to turn. The guards had their hands on the gates. The head of the execution detail was already inside the yard. I slammed my palm against the iron door and screamed that I had a signed judicial instrument from Judge Harlan Morse ordering an immediate halt. The silence that followed felt longer than my entire life. Then the gates opened. Elias Croft walked out of Castellan prison 6 weeks later not because someone showed him mercy, but because the truth finally could not be buried any further. Roland Fetch was formally charged, tried, and convicted the following spring. Every piece of evidence I had gathered was entered into the court record. The altered deposition was traced back to a court clerk who had been paid to make the change. The planted coat was confirmed through textile analysis conducted by a fabric merchant who had sold Aldrich Vane's coat supply and testified that bone button coats were standard in that lot. Everything held. Elias never said very much to me afterward. He didn't have to. He shook my hand the morning he was released, and he looked at me for a long moment like he was trying to understand how any of it had happened. I think I looked back at him the same way. I won't pretend that justice was fully restored. Elias lost 3 years of his life inside that prison. He lost his small farm. He lost the trust of neighbors who still whispered when he walked by. Truth can restore a person's dignity, but it cannot give back stolen time. And that reality has never stopped breaking my heart, no matter how many years pass between that morning and this one. What I know now that I did not know before is this: sometimes the loudest sound in history is not the execution bell itself. Sometimes it is the quiet voice of one person who simply refuses to stop searching for the truth, even when every door is closed, every official says no, and the clock has almost completely run out. I was that person once, and it is the most important thing I have ever done. Now I want to hear from you. If the entire world believed someone was guilty, would you have kept fighting for them the way I did? Tell me honestly in the comments, because I truly want to know. And if this story reminded you that justice only survives when people refuse to give up on it, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded of that today.